Okay, this is the second part of the New Deal lecture. And in the first part, we talked about the Agricultural Adjustment Act. We talked about things like the National Recovery Administration, the FDIC. Those were things to kind of immediately get the country going again during that kind of that 100 days and in the first couple of years. By 1935, the New Deal is going to take on kind of a second phase here. And so there's going to be a second wave of legislation and programs designed to, in one way or another, help various Americans. And so we'll kind of take a look at that here in the second New Deal. Okay, the Works Progress Administration, very much like the Public Works Administration, same letters, but just different, but kind of the same things. Most of it was employment for different types of infrastructure. So, like the Verrazano Bridge in New York, various tunnels, but a lot of just public works things where people could get jobs to make some money. But I think what's important about the WPA as well is that it also targeted people like artists and musicians and writers. I remember growing up as a kid, and we would drive through this town called Delta, which is way out in western Colorado. And there were these murals that were on the side of like one of their grocery stores and on another side of a building. And I remember asking my dad about that. And he said, well, those were during the Great Depression, where, the federal government paid these artists to paint these murals to just kind of make their town look better. And so that was a good example of the WPA. Now, they had a huge budget. And I don't think they used all $5 billion, but they had a huge budget. This was paid for with a lot of deficit spending where the government's borrowing money or printing money, whatever they can. But the idea here was to inject money back into the economy, to create jobs, to do things that are publicly good. Like we talked about, building schools, infrastructure, things like that. But then this way, the government's not just giving money out to people, but then they do something very important, hopefully, and that is to spend money in the economy. Great, Social Security Act. So if we remember from the first lecture, we talked about Dr. Townsend, who was promoting this idea of an old age pension, where you would, if you were part of that working class, so basically people that are 20 to 65, every time you have a paycheck, you would take a certain percentage out. I think today it's probably around 3% of your paycheck, but every paycheck, every time you get paid, you would pay into this government agency that's now called Social Security. And once you got to be, 64 and a half, 65, 67, whatever they have the age at, then you didn't have to work anymore. And even though this wasn't probably as much as you made when you were working, it would subsidize your income enough to make sure that you had the minimum amount that you could pay for, for food, for bills, for things like that. But then the other thing that it does is that it also, like if you have a husband that dies, then the wife would get that pension check to help her to keep living. Dependent children you'd get a little bit more if you had, 2 kids or 3 kids or 4 kids and the husband had died. Now, the interesting thing about the Social Security Act is it's really difficult to get rid of it. And so what you would have to do if you wanted to get rid of it today is you'd either have to cash everybody out the actual amount that they've put into the system, or you would go to, the next generation of workers and say, okay, everybody that was born before this day, you're not going to ever put money into Social Security, but you are responsible for yourself in terms of when you retire. And that's just probably not going to happen. And so this is one of the most enduring legacies of the New Deal. Social Security, you try to get rid of an old age pension. You watch that old guy hit you with his cane and say, don't take my money, sonny boy. So, the Social Security is very much a part of that New Deal legacy. Okay, the other thing that Social Security helps to do is it sets up a federal system of unemployment insurance. And so this way, when you are, when you get laid off for whatever reason, every time that you get a check, you're not only putting money into Social Security for a pension, but you're also putting in just in case that just in case you get laid off, you can kind of, in a way, pay yourself. So it's like you put money in unemployment, and then once you need it, then that money kind of pays you back. And you typically, again, don't get all of your wages, you get a percentage of it. But this way, there's a system set in place to where you can still make somewhat of an income until you can find another job or until your job puts you back on. And typically speaking, these systems work pretty well when you don't have everybody at once trying to get them. Like right now, because of COVID, we have a lot of people that are taking from unemployment, and states don't have enough money to pay that unemployment unless the federal government steps in. So that's really what the stimulus package is going to do, is to make sure that these people can get their unemployment benefits. And as long as people don't take advantage of that and kind of build that system, the system is pretty nice. Okay. The impact of this is that, remember, the biggest burden lies upon the worker bees in the middle class. They're the biggest group. They're the ones that put the most into the system. Rich people have to put into it too, but for the most part, I'd say the middle class take the biggest burden of Social Security. And the critics of the Social Security Act, they just don't like it because you can't get rid of it. I mean, basically, if you get rid of it right away, you're going to screw over people that have put into the system for 30 years. And they're saying, wait a minute, I put in every paycheck for the last 30 to 35, 40 years. You're going to give me my money, or you're going to give me my money back. So it's really difficult for the government to ever get rid of this program. And probably we as workers don't want it to. All right. Labor during the New Deal. I have told you repeatedly throughout this class that labor has never done very well. Well, I'm about to tell you differently. This is a time in American history where the federal government, now make sure you're sitting down to hear this, the federal government is actually going to do things that help workers. They are actually going to intervene on behalf of workers. Now, we saw this a little bit in the NIRA, right? The National Industrial Recovery Act. When they created the NRA, they encouraged factory owners and business leaders to get together with their workers and to hash out, wages, like what we call wage floors, which effectively is a minimum wage, maximum work weeks and things like that. Well, here's where we're going to see it cemented into federal law. Now, keep in mind that, this doesn't apply to everyone in terms of every job, but it's going to cover quite a few people. And so the National Labor Relations Act is almost like, the Magna Carta of labor. The Wagner Act, as it's known, I don't think hardly anybody calls it the National Labor Relations Act. Everybody refers to it as the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act is what officially gives unions the right to exist and what gives them the right to collectively bargain, which means negotiate. And when you think of collectively bargain, that just means they have the right to talk to their superiors, their people that are paying them to collectively bargain. Okay. And then along with that, the Fair Labor Standards Act is a federal law that guarantees a minimum wage. Now, just to make you laugh, right now the Democrats are pushing for $15 an hour, which they're not going to get. Right now, I think it's like 7 something. So it's a nice dream, but the Democrats aren't going to get their $15 an hour. Just to give you an indication how different it was back then, I believe the minimum wage in the 1930s when they made this, like 1937, was like 40 cents. So it was a minimum wage of 40 cents an hour. But almost as important as a minimum wage and a maximum work week of 40 hours. And after 40 hours, you're supposed to pay them overtime. We also had, pretty strict restrictions on child labor. And those things, guys, are still around today. So when we talk about enduring legacies of the New Deal, man, the Social Security Administration, the Wagner Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, those things are still around today and are very, sacred to labor. Restrictions on child labor for, I think they set it at 16. And a lot of those things are still around today. Next. Now, the TVA was a great program, but the TVA really only helped out directly the Tennessee Valley. And even though that encompassed several states, it's still a small area. There's a much greater area or bigger need for rural electrification. And remember, in terms of development and standard of living, when you get electricity, you can heat your house with it, you can cook your food with it. you can see at night. I mean, there's all these benefits to electricity. You can run a refrigerator so you can store food. So it was a big deal to get these rural areas, and by rural we mean these farming areas, get them electricity. And so the federal government went on a ginormous campaign to build electric lines and to create what is today our country's electric grid, and to get people connected to the electric grid, to give them cheap, affordable electricity, and that would raise the standard of living in the rural areas. So they loaned out money to utility companies that would then actually build the electricity, and they would build dams. They would do all sorts of things to get electricity to the rural area. If you guys remember in human geography, you probably remember something called the Three Gorges Dam. Well, I mean, that's their Tennessee Valley Authority. That's their attempt to get rural electrification to their rural people, their poor people. And so the Rural Electrification Administration was huge in increasing the standard of living for people in the rural areas. And just to see how effective they were in 1929, at the outbreak of the Great Depression, 10% of farms had electricity. Contrast this with, basically 20 years later, in 1950, 80% of farms had electricity. So that's a huge increase in the standard of living. Okay, we're going to talk about in society and culture of the 1930s. We'll talk more about minority groups and how they did under the New Deal. And we'll talk a little bit about this at the end of the lecture too. But Native Americans, I wouldn't say they loved Franklin Roosevelt, but probably more than most presidents, they respected Franklin Roosevelt because of what was kind of collectively known as the Indian New Deal. More importantly and more directly, it's called the Indian Reorganization Act. The federal government created a Bureau on Indian Affairs. I think today it's part of the Department of the Interior. But this guy, John Collier, who was part Native American himself, he became a great mediator or liaison between the federal government and the Native tribes. And the Native tribes really liked him for the most part. Now, what the Indian Reorganization Act does is it effectively nullifies the Dawes Severalty Act. So if you remember, the Dawes Severalty Act really screwed over the Native Americans. It basically was a law that forced them to try to assimilate into American culture. It took away tribal lands as a collective unit and broke them down into individual homesteads. I mean, they were trying to make natives not live collectively. They're trying to make them live as individual farmers like Americans did. And then they encouraged them to go to American schools. They built American schools where the kids could learn English. And really, they're just trying to stamp out the Native American in them. That was the Dawes Severalty Act. Well, the Reorganization Act, it allows Native Americans to, again, live collectively, live as tribes, really allow them to try to salvage what they have left of their culture. And that's great. And I mean, it's good that they let them do it. But by this time, the United States had really damaged Native cultures around the country. So, I mean, it was a good idea, but I don't know how much it really helped. Okay. The election of 1936. So as you can see, the election of 1936 is what we call a mandate election, which means that's a lot of blue on the map, which means very few places were strongly against FDR. We do have some. Remember, we have some Democrats turning against him in the South, these conservative Democrats that are going to almost act like Republicans. We're going to see that there are business and community leaders up in the North that are against him. And then still, remember, we still have people as of 1936 that don't think he's doing quite enough. We're going to see a surge in the Communist Party, a surge in the Socialist Party, but FDR is going to do enough to steal their thunder to make sure that they don't get too popular. But this really is this. You're not going to see many elections like this. This is a landslide. FDR interpreted this as a mandate. He's like, you know what? They really like me, and I have a lot of power, and I can do with it what I want. And the point of me saying this is that this is kind of the beauty of American politics, is that probably this is FDR at his most powerful, and yet he's not going to become a dictator. Even though he had dictatorial powers, so to speak, at certain points during his presidency, he's going to make some political blunders in his second term that are going to cost him. And, he's not going to hold this mandate kind of forever. We'll talk about those things. The other thing that I want you to get down is this idea of political reorganization. The New Deal shifts around a lot of political alliances, kind of like the 1850s did. So this would be like kind of a good comparison where we see, northern Whigs become Republicans, Free Soilers become Republicans, Southern Whigs become Democrats. We have a political reorganization in the election of 1936 like we hadn't seen in a long time. We see that the Democrats are in control of the government. They're going to be in control of the government for the most part for the next probably 25 years from here on out. And they have a broad coalition. They have a lot of different ingredients into the Democrat Party. They have Southern and Western farmers that are benefiting from New Deal ideas like the AAA, the Rural Electrification Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority. We've got, the urban working class that's benefiting from things like the Wagner Act and the Labor Relations Board, obviously the NRA up to this point in 1936. So a lot of those working class people, they love FDR. Anybody that's poor and unemployed, single, males that have benefited from things like the CCC. But an interesting thing's happening with African Americans. You're starting to see that these programs that are, even though they're still segregated and even though there's discrimination, a lot of these programs, FARA, for one, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the CCC, these things also helped African Americans. And so we're starting to see that for the first time, and think about this, right? Since the days of Lincoln in the 1860s, African Americans that could actually vote, they voted Republican this whole time. Now we're going to start to see African Americans shift their alliances, and this is around still today. And so this is where African Americans really begin to switch over to the Democratic Party. And that's a big deal. Okay, all right, and then of course liberals, as always, are in the Democratic Party, what we call progressives. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple of the blunders that FDR makes to go from, really probably the most popular president we've ever had at that time to chinks in the armor. All right, and so one of the only roadblocks to the New Deal that FDR faces from the Supreme Court. Recall that the Supreme Court had struck down the AAA, the NRA. And so FDR, he believed that the only way that he could get around the Supreme Court was by increasing the number of Supreme Court justices, knowing full well he was the one that was going to get to nominate them to the Supreme Court. And then that way, he could get these things passed. They couldn't strike down legislation. But he misread. The mandate that he was given. And as soon as he starts doing this, people were like, whoa, what's he doing? He's trying to take too much power. And this kind of freaked out the average American. Now, furthermore, believe it or not, the conservative justices, in the meantime, as FDR is trying to do this, actually ruled fairly liberally in a couple of things that kept Social Security around. FDR expected that the conservative Republican Supreme Court would strike down Social Security and the Wagner Act, and in fact, they validated them. And so this sort of steals the thunder from FDR. FDR has been kind of trying to steal the thunder from, Huey Long and Father Coughlin and stuff. This is the Supreme Court, in a way, stealing thunder from FDR. And again, I think it's important that you write down most average Americans at this time, they were not in favor of FDR doing this. This is something that a dictator tends to do. And even though FDR tried to package it to the American people like, the justices are old and they're overworked and we need to inject some fresh blood, really anybody with half a brain could see he's just trying to control the Supreme Court. That would have given him control of all three branches because the House and the Senate were in Democrats, were in the Democrats' house or in their favor. And certainly the executive branch was. This would have given him a third branch. And so people were against this. Okay. All right. Rise of the labor unions. Remember, this is one of the few times in American history where we actually see labor supported by the federal government. That's a big thing to remember. Now, the AFL, they are still around, but the AFL, remember, they are concerned with skilled artisans, so what they call craft unions. But industrial unionism, that is what is on the rise during this time. Now, the Committee for Industrial Organization, they are a big industrial union group. And so these are like the factory workers. That's the way I would think of these. These are the people that unionize to organize the factory workers, the factory workers without a lot of skill. So if I am a skilled person in a factory where I have one of those jobs that pays me a little bit more, I'm probably in the AFL. But if I am just kind of the run-of-the-mill assembly line worker, then I'm going to join the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So it's the CIO, and so the Committee for Industrial Organization, they become the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So just know them as the CIO, and they are led by a very charismatic, kind of flamboyant guy by the name of John L. Lewis. Now, John L. Lewis is kind of instrumental in helping to create a new kind of strike, basically the sit-in or the sit-down strike. And it's very successful. It's successful at a General Motors plant for automobiles. And, they asked the federal government to issue an injunction, and they did not. The federal government was on the side of the workers. So again, this is a great example to use in terms of the very few times that the federal government has said to labor, we've got your back. We're not going to back management, just like we've always done. Okay. By 1937, the CIO had claimed over 3.5 million members, and there is John L. Lewis. Okay. So we're going to kind of take a look at here. Does the New Deal, does it work? Well, kind of. And so, if we look at where unemployment was the highest was in 1933, and then we have the 100 days, we have the first New Deal, and we can see that this injects money into the economy. We start to see the unemployment go down below 50%. And then when we get to, really 1936, 1937, FDR kind of feels like he's done enough, that he's kind of, got to a point where he doesn't want to overreach his bounds. And so he cuts spending, and he cuts deficit spending, and he cuts a lot of the programs of like the WPA and things like that. And all of a sudden, unemployment spikes back up. And this is kind of referred to as the recession of 1937, or what it's usually called is the Roosevelt recession, okay, the FDR recession. And then you can see that the second New Deal hits, and unemployment's going down. But we do want to understand that really most of that blue line that you guys see there, that blue line is really World War I. Really, the biggest thing I want you to write down on this slide is the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. World War II does. All right. Once the Japanese bomb us at Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden it's all guns a-blazing, we're going to increase factory work. We're going to start cranking out planes and tanks and guns and bullets and all this stuff. That's really what gets us out of the recession. So World War II is really the blue line there that dips down in the 40s. Okay, last couple parts here. New Deal for all, the South and the West. Remember, the South and the West are some of the greatest beneficiaries of New Deal projects, of New Deal money. So we have things like the Hoover Dam way out west, the Civilian Conservation Corps, a lot of things they're doing, the Rural Electrification Administration, the TVA. Those are all things that help people in the South and West. And so, those really good for them if they're not a minority group, right? So like white males or families, white families that were in the South and the West, they were helped by a lot of the programs of the New Deal. Women, not so much, although we start to see as a result of, I want to highlight Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of FDR. She was very forceful, and she put a lot of pressure on her husband to include women and minorities in at least discussions around the New Deal. Whether they actually helped them or not, was another thing. But there was some help for women in terms of Frances Perkins. She became the very first cabinet minister that's ever been on a president's cabinet that was a woman. She was a Secretary of Labor secretary. Social Security Administration. She was crucial in making sure that there was a provision in Social Security that if a husband died, that the pension would then go to the widow, to the wife. And so Eleanor Roosevelt is a crucial key part of the New Deal when it comes to minorities, African Americans. Eleanor Roosevelt was very close to people like Mary Bethune. Mary Bethune was an African American civil rights advocate, and she was a good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. And so they would talk from time to time, and kind of unofficially, they became what was known as the Black Cabinet. And that then what would happen is that after Mary Bethune and friends like that would talk to Eleanor Roosevelt, well, then Eleanor Roosevelt would go talk to her husband and say, "Hey, look, these people need help, and you need to do that." And so, really, for the most part, what we would say is that the New Deal, it wasn't like greatly helpful to African Americans, but it wasn't like harmful to them. And so we look at a group like the CCC, where African Americans could join the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, granted, they weren't paid as much as their white counterparts, and they were segregated away from them. But hey, it's better than nothing. So it's not great, but it's not like they didn't include them at all. All right, and then Native Americans. Let's just remind ourselves the Indian New Deal, the Indian Reorganization Act, that got rid of the Dawes Severalty Act and allowed Native Americans to then be able to live in a tribal way. Okay, so again, what ended the Great Depression certainly wasn't the New Deal. It was going to be government spending during World War II, which you can see in the middle of 1940 to 1950. That's an impressive amount of government spending on defense. Okay, last slide, legacies of the New Deal. So one of the biggest things that the New Deal does is it changes the role of the federal government in the United States, really forever. Now we expect a lot out of our federal government, whereas before the federal government was really a non-entity for the most part, and they weren't expected to do that much in terms of, just let the states do everything. Now we sort of demand that the federal government, especially in times of crisis, step in and direct the ship. And I mean, that's been something that we've expected during COVID, is that the federal government prop up the states who are having trouble with unemployment benefits and give things like a stimulus package. Okay, next, the beginning of a welfare state. What we mean is not by a welfare program, but that the government acts like a safety net. So unemployment insurance, things like federal relief, things like Social Security. These are all things that help people that really can't help themselves. And those are programs that start during this time. And like we said, like with Social Security is a great example of being part of the welfare state. This is something that's still around today. Okay, the emergence of a broker state. The federal government has a new role. Instead of just blindly backing business all the time, now what we mean by this is that they become a mediator, that they are kind of responsible for everybody, and they try to make management and labor. They try to help the farmers. They try to do everything to kind of be fair. And although I would still say, especially in 2021, our government still has a very friendly atmosphere with business leaders. It's a little bit different. Their labor unions, they are taken into consideration by the federal government, whereas before they never did. Okay, next. Democrats really from the 1930s up until Nixon takes over in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and then not till Reagan. When we get to Reagan in 1980, that's really the return of conservatism. It's kind of the 1980 election is almost like the 1920 election. It's that's the return to conservatism. But for the most part, for 40 years, the Democrats are pretty much in control of the government, which they haven't been for a long time, since before the Civil War. Okay, we would say, and we've said this before, that the New Deal did not end the Depression, but it certainly stabilized the economy. It changed the relationship between the government and the farmers. Today, the farmers get huge subsidies from the federal government, but it did help. It didn't end it, but it did help. So the question that always gets asked is, did FDR do enough? Did he not do enough? Was this a revolutionary thing, or was this too conservative? And that's kind of up to you to argue. I think you could find things on both sides. I mean, certainly things like a pension program and for the elderly, those are all big changes. But if we look at them today, were they? So that's what you would kind of want to think about in terms of Was the New Deal, did it cause a lot of change, or really did it just mollify people? Did it get us through? Did it really change enough? And that's really up for you to decide. Okay. All right. That should be it for the New Deal. Thank you for tuning in to our 2 lectures.